Welcome to another episode of You Gonna Learn Today. The book I want to focus on today is called The Sum of Us: What Racism Costs Everybody and How We Can Prosper Together. It's by Heather McGhee. And basically, in this book, she talks about the fact that policies that were intended to wreak havoc on the black community essentially harm others as well. She opens the book by talking about a young African American boy who drowned in the early 1950s in the Patapsco River in Baltimore, Maryland, because he couldn't swim in the public pools. And as a result of not being able to swim in public pools, he swam in the river and drowned. 3 years later, the NAACP sued the city and they won. And this required pools to integrate. But after that, we see a number of pools opening up in communities, in private communities. And this is another way for people to maintain segregation. She writes that in many cities across the South, however, so cities such as New Orleans, such as Jackson, Mississippi, such as Montgomery, Alabama, they closed their pools down so that nobody could swim. So the consequence of a policy that was targeting black people basically hurt everybody, as hot as it gets down there. The book goes on to talk about all the ways that this zero-sum mentality hurts everybody. Many of these policies are basically an attack on the civil rights movement and gains that were made during that period. And she provides a whole lot of examples about how racial resentment basically harms whites as well. For instance, she talks about predatory lending and the predatory lending crisis of the early 2000s and how black people were targeted with subprime mortgages. And as a result of these subprime mortgages, many people lost their homes. But she said it wasn't just black people that lost their homes. There were a lot of white people that lost their homes too. White folks were caught up in the crossfire. She talks about the healthcare system and how many states wouldn't expand Medicaid and because the narrative was that it was a form of reparations. And so again, in the process, it wasn't just blacks that were impacted. She says that whites walked into traps that were not set for them. She goes on to talk about the history of voting rights, and she talks about efforts to limit black participation in the voting process through things such as voter ID, name matching, and purging rosters also hurts whites. And she gives examples of how white women in particular who have been impacted because if they get married and they change their names and their names don't match, they may have more difficulty voting. She says that these efforts to maintain a racial hierarchy is costly. In her book, she talks about environmental issues. She talks about education. But I think the brilliant part of her book is what she talks about are remedies. And one of the things she recommends is cross-racial organizing, how we all pool together so that we can all win and that we don't have a zero-sum game. And this book sort of spoke to me as we are just past the election of 2024 and we see all of these policies being reeled back in ways that harm not just black communities, but the LGBT community, women, people with disabilities. And so we're going to have to think about what's next. You're going to learn today.